The human girl walked into the galaxy's deadliest combat academy, carrying no armor, no energy weapon, and 3 days later the instructors found her sharpening a knife made from a monster that had already killed 4 senior cadets. The galaxy, as any seasoned traveler will tell you, is full of terrifying things: collapsing stars, rogue antimatter fields, species that consider eye contact a declaration of war. And yet, somehow, nothing in my 11 years of military education prepared me for the moment a human female walked into the Interstellar Combat Academy carrying nothing but a small bag, a calm expression, and the energy of someone who had already decided the building belonged to her. My name is Vrelux, Senior Cadet, 3rd Tier Combat Track, pride of the Veth homeworld, and, as of that particular morning, an absolute fool who thought he had seen everything worth seeing. Let me set the scene properly, because it matters. The Interstellar Combat Academy sits on the edge of the Drennak system, built into the shell of a dead moon, reinforced with 7 layers of composite plating and staffed by instructors who collectively have survived things that would make a lesser species retire permanently to a quiet planet and never speak again. Every year, cadets from across 43 allied species arrive to train. Every year they are sorted, assessed, and quietly terrified into competence. I was standing at the upper observation rail with my closest companion, Cadet Dukai, a Sorvian with 6 arms, a permanent expression of mild contempt, and the best plasma blade form I had ever personally witnessed. We were watching the new intake file through the lower gates. It was tradition among senior cadets to identify, early, which of the newcomers would last the term and which ones would be requesting a transfer to the diplomatic track by week 2. It was not a cruel tradition. It was an accurate one. Grafnak batch looks solid, Dukai said, tilting his head toward a cluster of large, armored reptilians moving in precise formation. They always produce decent close combat cadets. I said, because I was already distracted. There, in the middle of the intake line, between a 7-foot Brillian with natural chest plating and a 4-armed Yessi who was already eyeing the training compound with what I can only describe as professional hunger, was a human. Now, I had read about humans. Everyone had read about humans. The briefings existed. The academic literature was substantial. I had consumed approximately 300 pages of interspecies threat assessments filed by various military councils across the allied species, and every single one of them included a section on humans that was frankly confusing in its inconsistency. Some reports called them dangerously adaptable, others called them emotionally unstable. One report, filed by a Kreth border commander, simply said, "Do not let them get bored." But reading about humans and seeing one standing in your academy intake courtyard are 2 very different experiences. She was small. That was the first thing. Not small in the way that some compact species are small while radiating physical threat. Small in the way that made you wonder if there had been an administrative error. She had no visible armor plating, no venom glands along the jaw, no secondary limbs, no exoskeleton, no natural weapons of any kind that I could identify from the observation rail. She had 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 legs, and hair, which is a feature I will never fully understand as a biological choice, and she was looking around the academy courtyard with an expression that was either extreme confidence or complete ignorance of her situation. Either option was, I felt, equally likely. "Is that a human?" Dukai asked. "I believe so," I said. "She is very small." "Yes, she has no armor." "Correct." Dukai was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I give her 4 days before she transfers." I gave her 6, because I am by nature generous. We were both, as it turned out, catastrophically wrong. The first week at the academy is structured around one central event, which is the Forge Day. Every incoming cadet is given access to the Academy's weapons fabrication facility, a vast, loud, magnificent hall of fire and precision engineering where you are expected to either build your primary weapon or formally claim one through a trial of merit. The philosophy behind it is simple. The weapon you carry into your first year of training is the weapon you will know better than your own heartbeat by the end of it. So you had better choose carefully, or build wisely, or, if you are particularly gifted, do something that makes the instructors pay attention. Vrelox, for the record, built a plasma blade. It took me 2 full days, 3 burned fingertips, 1 argument with a fabrication drone, and a level of focus I had not applied to anything since my entrance examination. I was proud of it. It hummed with a clean blue frequency, balanced perfectly in my primary grip, and it had cost me every credit of the discretionary stipend I had saved for 6 months. Around me, the other cadets worked with similar intensity. The Grethnak batch constructed resonance whips with the practiced ease of people who had been handling energy weapons since childhood. The Yesi cadets built pulse lances, long and efficient. Even the quieter, more academic species who had arrived on the diplomatic-to-combat crossover track were putting together functional short-range stun blades with reasonable competence. Sarah Chin walked into the forge, looked at all of it, and then stood very still for approximately 20 minutes. I noticed her because Dukai nudged me, and Dukai only nudges me when something is entertaining. She was standing in front of the primary materials wall, which is floor-to-ceiling storage of every alloy, synthetic compound, energy cell, and fabrication component the Academy stocks. She was reading the labels, slowly, all of them. Then she turned around, looked at the fabrication floor one more time, and walked out. Not ran, not stormed. Walked. Calmly, with purpose, like someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. She left, Dukai said. I see that, I said. The forge day period is 3 days. You cannot claim a trial weapon if you do not begin construction. I am aware of the rules, Dukai. He watched the door she had walked through. I am changing my estimate to 2 days, he said. She came back on day 3, the last possible day of the forge period. She walked in carrying something wrapped in a piece of training cloth, set it on the central examination table, and stood next to it with her hands at her sides and the same calm expression she had worn when she arrived. Instructor Hresh, who ran Forge Day with the energy of someone who had personally witnessed every possible way a cadet could fail at weapons construction, walked over. The room went quiet. Not because anyone orchestrated it, it just happened. The way rooms go quiet when something is about to be interesting. Sarah unwrapped the cloth. It was a blade, not a plasma blade, not a fabricated alloy construction of any kind, not anything that had come within 10 feet of the materials wall or the fabrication floor. It was carved bone. Real bone. Pale, dense, with a natural curve along the spine of the blade that suggested whoever, or whatever, it had originally belonged to, had a skeletal structure built for something other than gentle living. The edge had been worked down to a sharpness that even from 6 feet away made something primal in my brain send up a quiet, polite alarm signal. The handle was wrapped in a strip of the same hide that covered the cloth she had used to carry it in, and the whole thing looked like it had been finished with a level of care that you usually only saw in weapons that had taken months to complete. Instructor Hresh looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Sarah. Then he looked at the blade again. "Where?" he said, and his voice had a quality I had not heard from him before, which was the quality of someone choosing their words carefully. "Did you get the material for this?" Sarah looked up at him. "The training forest," she said. Behind the eastern compound wall, there was a Vrath predator running loose in the 3rd quadrant. I dealt with it. The bone structure looked useful, so I kept the relevant parts. The room did not just go quiet. The room went the kind of quiet that happens when everyone present simultaneously stops breathing, reassesses the situation, and finds the new information extremely difficult to organize into a coherent response. I will tell you what a Vrath predator is so you understand why. A Vrath predator is a Category 4 threat organism. It masses approximately 400 kilos. It has 8 primary limbs, the front 4 of which end in cutting appendages that are, per the Academy's own field manual, capable of penetrating standard-grade combat armor at close range. It hunts by tracking bioelectric signatures, meaning it can find you whether you are moving or still, visible or hidden. It is venomous, it is fast, It is, according to the same field manual, to be engaged only by teams of 4 or more fully armed and armored cadets using coordinated suppression protocols. 2 cycles before our intake arrived, a Vrath predator that had escaped the Academy's specimen containment had killed 4 senior cadets before it was neutralized by a full instructor response team. 4 senior cadets, fully armed, working together. Sarah Chin had apparently dealt with one, alone, during her first 2 days at the Academy, and her primary concern afterward was whether the bone density was sufficient for an edge weapon. Du Kai, standing next to me, made a sound I had never heard from him before. It took me a moment to identify it as the Sorvian equivalent of a laugh, not a polite one. Instructor Fresh looked at Sarah for another long moment. Then he picked up the blade, examined the edge, set it back down, and said, "Report to my office after dinner. Bring the blade." "Yes, sir," Sarah said. She re-wrapped it in the cloth, tucked it under her arm, and walked back to her station. The forge stayed quiet for a long time after that. First sparring session of the term. Standard procedure. Senior cadets paired against new intake cadets as a calibration exercise. The goal officially was to give instructors a baseline for each new cadet's combat skill level. The goal unofficially was to remind the new intake that they had a great deal left to learn and that humility was a useful quality to develop early. I was paired against Sarah Chin. I want to be clear that I did not request this pairing. I also want to be clear that I was not, at that point, approaching the match with any genuine concern. I had a plasma blade, 11 years of formal combat training, a physical advantage in reach and mass, and the home field familiarity of someone who had been training in that specific sparring room for 3 years. She had a bone knife and 2 days of settled attendance records. I was, to use a human phrase I later learned, setting myself up beautifully. We squared off in the center of the sparring floor. I activated my plasma blade. The blue hum of it filled the room. Sarah unrolled her bone blade from the cloth wrapping and held it in a low grip. Her weight slightly back, her feet placed in a pattern I did not immediately recognize as a formal stance from any combat discipline in the Academy's training curriculum. She was looking at me the way you look at a puzzle you have already mostly solved. The match started. I opened with a standard high-line diagonal, which is a dominant opening move against smaller opponents because it forces them to either retreat or commit to a block. And a block against a plasma blade from a smaller opponent with a non-energy weapon is generally a losing proposition. Sarah did neither. She moved sideways, not backward. Sideways and slightly toward me, inside the arc of the blade, and redirected my forearm with her free hand rather than engaging the weapon directly. She was not fighting the blade. She was fighting me. I adjusted. I shifted to a midline pressing sequence, which is designed to remove the opponent's footwork advantage by advancing the engagement range. Sarah retreated 1 step, 2 steps, let me close the distance, and then moved in a direction that I can only describe as geometrically inconsiderate, ending up behind my lead shoulder where I needed to rotate to follow her, and, in rotating, briefly lost my balance orientation. She did not take the opening. She waited. She was letting me make mistakes and cataloging them. I used 4 more techniques. 4. Every single one of them. She adjusted around. Not by matching force, not by blocking, but by moving in ways that made the technique less effective and occasionally made me feel slightly foolish. By the 6th exchange, the watching cadets had gone completely silent. By the 8th, I was genuinely working at full effort, and she was still wearing that expression. On the 9th exchange, I overextended. Not by much. Not enough that any cadet at my level should have been punished for it. But Sarah moved in that same sideways, interior angle direction. Her hand caught my weapon arm at the wrist, her leg was behind my rear foot in a placement I had not noticed her setting up, and the next thing I was aware of was the training floor being directly in front of my face. I was on my back. The bone blade was at my throat, 2 inches from my throat, held there with a steadiness that suggested she was in no hurry. The room was silent. I stared up at the ceiling. The ceiling, for the record, has 17 structural panels and a faint scoring mark from an incident involving a 3rd-year energy discharge test that went sideways 6 years ago. I know this because I spent a notable amount of time looking at it. Then, From somewhere to my left, someone started laughing. Genuine, full, delighted laughing. It was Dukai. Of course it was Dukai. Sarah looked down at me with no particular expression. "Good match," she said. I thought about several responses. I settled on, yes, it was, because it had been. Humiliatingly, thoroughly, and completely genuinely, it had been a good match. Commander Hresh did not run toward drama. He walked toward it, slowly, with the bearing of someone who had already seen the end of the story and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. He was 8-limbed, gray-scaled, with a scar along his primary cranial ridge from a weapon type that the Academy still classified under restricted curriculum. He had fought in 3 wars, overseen 40 years of cadet training, and, according to Academy legend, had once completed the Gauntlet assessment course in under 6 minutes, while simultaneously filing a formal complaint about the course design. He called Sarah aside after the sparring session. I followed, because Dukai was right when he once told me that dignity is a fine quality, but curiosity has better outcomes. Hresh stood in the corridor outside the sparring room, looked at Sarah, and said nothing for a moment. This was not unusual. Hresh used silence as a precision instrument. "The Vrath hunt," he said finally. "It has been formally logged in your service record." Sarah nodded. "I figured it would be. It counts as your field trial assessment for the first term. You have passed." There was a pause. "First week?" I said, before I could stop myself. Hresh looked at me with an expression that communicated, clearly and without words, that I was welcome to be present in this corridor as long as I did not continue making noise. I was silent immediately. He turned back to Sarah. "I want to ask you something, Cadet, not as an assessment, as a practical question." Sarah said, "Go ahead, sir." "You walked into the forge, reviewed every available material and fabrication option, and walked out. You went into a forest with no formal equipment, neutralized a Category 4 threat organism, and produced a weapon from the remains. That is not standard intake behavior." "No, sir. What was wrong with the forge materials?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, not hesitant, thinking. "Nothing was wrong with them," she said. "They were all good, high quality, reliable under standard conditions." She paused. "I was thinking about non-standard conditions. If I build a weapon that depends on energy cells, calibrated frequency, or fabrication tolerances, I am also building in the ways it can fail. A plasma blade fails in a strong EM field. A pulse lance fails when it overheats. A resonance whip fails when the coupling ring corrodes." She touched the cloth-wrapped blade at her side. "This fails when I lose it. That is the only failure condition. I prefer to minimize variables." Hresh looked at her for a long time. Then he said the thing that stayed with me. Not for the rest of the term. For a long time after. "Every species that enters this academy brings something. The Grethnak bring physical force. The Yessi bring speed. The Sorvians bring precision. Do you know what humans bring, Cadet Chin?" Sarah waited. "Humans," Hresh said, "lack armor, venom, claws, enhanced sensory systems, and natural regeneration. Every physical metric places your species at a disadvantage in direct combat against the other species in this cohort." He paused. "What you have instead is far more disruptive. You look at something that is trying to kill you, and you begin taking notes. You do not experience danger as a signal to disengage. You experience it as information. That," he said, "is not a quality we can teach. It is a quality we can only try to keep up with." He turned and walked away down the corridor. I stood there for a moment. Dukai, who had apparently also followed despite my not noticing, said quietly, "She passed the field trial in week 1. "Yes," I said. "We did not pass ours until month 3. "I am aware, Dukai." He was quiet. Then, "I am not embarrassed. I am impressed." "So am I said. The academy barracks ran quiet after the second bell. Most cadets used the late hours for equipment maintenance, review work, or sleep, depending on their species' rest requirements. I used it for thinking, which Dukai had once told me was an inefficient use of time, and which I had continued doing anyway. 11 days into the term, I found Sarah in the common area of the barracks block, sitting cross-legged on one of the low benches, running a small flat stone along the edge of the bone blade in long, even strokes. The sound was quiet and rhythmic, and it did not stop when I sat down across from her. I had been composing this question for 11 days. I want that noted. "Were you afraid?" I asked. "In the forest, with the wrath." Sarah did not look up from the blade. She kept the stone moving. 1 stroke, 2 strokes. Then she stopped, held the blade up to the ambient light, checked the edge, and set it across her knees. She looked at me. Then she made the human sound that I had been trying to categorize since intake day. It is not quite a laugh. It is not quite a release of tension. It is somehow both, pressed together into something that sounds like a hiccup that tripped over a smile. Later, I would learn that humans make this sound specifically when the honest answer to a question is something they expect the listener to find surprising. "Yes," she said, "absolutely. I was terrified. I waited, because I could tell there was more. My hands were shaking," she said. "My heart rate was, I would guess, somewhere around catastrophic. I could not stop thinking about the size of its cutting limbs and whether the branch I was standing on would hold my weight long enough for what I was planning to work. I was afraid the entire time." She paused. "I was afraid from the moment I heard it moving in the 3rd quadrant until the moment it stopped moving." "Then why," I said, "did you not retreat, flag the location, wait for a response team?" Sarah looked at me with an expression that was genuinely thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Because it was between me and the compound," she said. "Retreating would have meant moving around it in territory it knew better than I did. Flagging and waiting would have taken time I was not certain I had. Moving toward it, carefully, with a plan, was the option with the best outcome probability." She picked the blade back up and looked at it. "Fear is not the enemy. Fear is information. It tells you exactly where the danger is. The question is not how do I stop being afraid. The question is what do I do with the information?" I sat with that for a moment. "You ran toward it," I said. "Carefully," she said. With a plan that involved killing a 400-kilo venomous apex predator and turning part of it into a kitchen knife." She looked at me. "Combat blade. Semantics." The human hiccup laugh again, softer this time. "Yes, with that plan, I went back to my bunk after that. I lay there for a long time thinking about the difference between fear as a signal to stop and fear as a signal to pay attention. These are not the same thing. I had always treated them as the same thing. I had never, until that conversation, considered that they might be different and that the difference might matter enormously. I did not sleep well that night, or the night after. On the 3rd night, I started taking notes on what I found frightening and why, and whether each instance was a stop signal or an information signal. It was the most useful thing I did that entire first term. The Gauntlet. If you have heard of the Academy and nothing else, you have heard of the Gauntlet. It is the end-of-term assessment, and its reputation is, if anything, understated. It is a course, roughly 3 kilometers in length, built through terrain that changes with every iteration, assessed on both completion time and survival condition of your equipment, and designed to expose every failure point in your combat preparation. Not your skills, your preparation. There is a difference, and the Gauntlet is specifically structured to find it. The electromagnetic field section disables any weapon with an active energy component. This means plasma blades go dark at the 2-kilometer mark, every iteration, no exceptions. The heat corridor in the 3rd phase overloads pulse lances. The humidity tunnel corrodes resonance whip coupling rings. The designers of the Gauntlet did this deliberately, because the lesson of the Gauntlet is not how well you fight when your equipment works. The lesson is how well you fight when it does not. Most cadets knew this going in. Knowing it and having solved it were different problems. The Grethnak cadets, with their natural armor and physical strength, got through the electromagnetic field section on raw force. Impressive, efficient, brutal. The HFY cadets improvised with broken lances as close-range battering implements with more creativity than you would expect. Dukai, magnificent and stubborn, completed the electromagnetic section by removing the energy component from his plasma blade entirely and using the inert casing as a blunt instrument while constructing a temporary replacement from terrain materials in the heat corridor. He finished 4th overall. I was genuinely moved. I finished 7th. My plasma blade failed at the field section as expected. I had prepared a backup stun blade for that phase. The stun blade failed at the heat corridor. I fought through the last 300 meters with the inert casing of my primary blade and sheer determination. 7th was not a poor result. I was not particularly proud of it either. I had known, going in, that I had a vulnerability in my equipment chain, and I had not fully solved it. Sarah Chin went into the gauntlet with the bone blade, a small utility tool clipped to her boot, and the expression of someone reviewing a checklist. The electromagnetic field section did not slow her down. The bone blade did not care about electromagnetic fields. It had no energy component, no calibration tolerances, no frequency coupling, no active systems of any kind. It was dense, worked bone with a good edge. Electromagnetic fields are completely indifferent to dense, worked bone with a good edge. The heat corridor did not slow her down. Bone, properly worked, handles heat retention differently than metal alloys. The humidity tunnel did not corrode anything, because there was nothing to corrode. She moved through the gauntlet the way someone moves through a space they have spent time thinking about. Not fast for the sake of fast, purposeful. Every choice in her movement visible as a choice rather than a reaction. She did not sprint through sections where sprinting created exposure. She did not slow in sections where slowing created opportunity for the environmental challenges. She maintained a pace that was, from the observer gallery where the senior cadets were watching, almost unreasonably calm. She completed the gauntlet in the second fastest time in Academy history. The fastest time on record was Instructor Hresch's. The difference was 43 seconds. The observer gallery was quiet for a moment after her time posted. Then Dukai, who was standing to my right with his arms folded and the expression he gets when something has exceeded his projections, said, "Second fastest, ever." "Yes," I said, "with a bone knife?" "It is a combat blade, Dukai." "She told you that?" "Yes." He unfolded his arms, looked at her time on the board, looked at the bone blade she was rewrapping in its cloth at the finish line below. "I finish 4th, he said, "with 6 arms, a precision-fabricated backup system, and 3 years of gauntlet preparation study." "You finished 4th, I agreed. "That is genuinely excellent." "She finished 2nd, all time." He paused. "With a weapon she built from something that tried to eat her." There was nothing I could add to that. It was simply accurate. I watched her wrap the blade and clip it to her side. She was not celebrating. She was not displaying anything in particular. She looked the way she had looked on intake day, standing in the courtyard with her small bag and her calm expression, like someone who had assessed the situation, formed a plan, and executed it to the outcome she had expected. I realized, standing in the observer gallery, that this was how she always looked, and that I had spent the first 2 weeks of the term interpreting that expression as the confidence of ignorance, when it was actually something much simpler and much harder to build. It was the look of someone who had already done the work. Every senior cadet at the Academy is expected to file a quarterly assessment report to their homeworld's military council. This is a formal communication, reviewed by actual council members, and it is understood to be a document of record. The format guidelines are 14 pages long. The expected length is substantial. The Council of the Veth Homeworld takes these reports seriously and files them in the official Military Intelligence Archive. My quarterly report for that term was 3 sentences. I debated this for approximately 1 hour before I submitted it. I considered adding context, elaboration, supporting documentation. I considered including the sparring session footage, the gauntlet results, the Vroth Huntfield report, Instructor Hresch's corridor comments, the conversation in the barracks. I had notes on all of it. In the end, I deleted everything except 3 sentences, because sometimes precision matters more than volume, and sometimes the most important thing you can say fits in very little space. The report read as follows. Cadet Sarah Chin, human, neutralized a Category 4 Vrath predator during her first week of intake, using no formal equipment, and constructed a primary combat weapon from the remains. Her combat blade carries no energy dependency and outperformed all fabricated weapons in the Academy's electromagnetic and environmental assessment conditions. She recorded the second fastest gauntlet completion time in Academy history. I recommend, with full conviction, that we never, under any circumstances, give humans reason to feel unwelcome at this institution. The Council responded 3 weeks later with a formal acknowledgement and a request for elaboration. I filed a follow-up report. It was 4 sentences, and the 4th one simply said, "She was afraid the whole time and she went in anyway. Please factor this into your assessments." I did not hear back about that one. I assumed they were thinking about it. Some information I have found takes a while to organize into a coherent response. The galaxy is full of terrifying things: collapsing stars, rogue antimatter fields, species that consider eye contact a declaration of war, and one human female at the Interstellar Combat Academy, sitting cross-legged on a barracks bench in the quiet after second bell, running a flat stone along the edge of a blade made from something that had tried to kill her, in long, even strokes with no particular expression and absolutely nowhere else she would rather be. The stone moved. The edge held. That was enough.